Here at the VFW Post in Fort Lee. This taped interview, digital film interview, is being produced by the Fort Lee Film Commission and the Fort Lee Historical Society in conjunction with our 2012 exhibit at the Fort Lee Museum, a centennial tribute to Universal Studios, which was born in Fort Lee in 2012. What we're doing this year is interviewing people in Fort Lee and who are originally from Fort Lee about their memories of the film industry in Fort Lee and their memories of working in that industry. And we're starting off with the big kahuna of film in Fort Lee, the commander of our VFW Post, president of the Common Sense Society, and member of the Fort Lee Historical Society, James Viola. And we're going to just ask Jimmy a few questions, which he's going to share his memories with us. And Jim, to start off, what are your earliest memories of the motion picture industry in Fort Lee?
Well, my mother and my father worked in the motion picture industry in Fort Lee. They used to tell us stories. It was at that time on the corner of Linwood Avenue and Main Street. There were the ruins of the studios. I remember walking past there, and the water tower was still there for 20th Century Fox. That building was a red building, red brick building, was still there. And they had the ruins of the fire and everything else that took place during 1927 when they had the big fire there. And my father used to work in the vaults, which was down underneath there. And he was telling me stories there that, because they were dealing with nitrate, and nitrate would go up in 2 seconds. It was like a time bomb. But the main thing that I learned about the motion picture industry in Fort Lee is that I worked afternoons at this building here. This was the College of Fort Lee. Everybody graduated from Consolidated and worked up there. Then from there you went to New York or you went to a better job. And every Friday night at the Fort Lee Diner, you had this little clique, my mother and all the old timers that would sit there and talk about the motion picture industry during when they were young. Because they used to say to my mother, how come you didn't go out to the West Coast when everybody went out there? She says, we didn't have a father that would let us go out there 2,000 miles away. And anyway, we were never offered to go out on the West Coast. My mother was a printer. She worked in the different laboratories that they had back at the studios on Linwood Avenue. And she was 13 years old. She was working. She was telling me that when they shoot the movies, every school kid in the borough of Fort Lee was in a movie. They emptied out all the schools. And never realizing I lived on the corner of Palisade Avenue and Main Street. And there was a shack, which is the bank parking lot today, the First National Bank, but it's the Bank of America parking lot. There was a little shack there. And this old man used to come out, he was a bastard. He used to holler at us for every little thing, holler at us. Never realized, but in the front of the store he used to have photos. Never realized that guy was called Double R. He was the head cameraman at that time in the motion picture industry. When I got to realize the industry and the job that he had during Fort Lee and how far he has fallen, because he was living there, and you never had a chance to talk to him or stuff like that. But there was many people in Fort Lee that had big jobs during that time in the motion picture industry.
Let's talk about your dad for a minute. You said he worked where, did he actually work in Fox, or after Fox he worked in a laboratory there?
No, he worked in the vaults.
He worked in the vaults for Fox?
For Fox.
For Fox, okay.
Yeah.
So he was, not only your mother, but your father was there early on.
Oh, yeah.
When they were making pictures. Now, your mom was working in the laboratories, the printing areas on Linwood Avenue as well, which was one of the biggest concentration of film studios.
Yeah.
So when you were a kid, you had this history because that's how your parents at some point made a living,
Yes.
like a lot of people in Fort Lee. Now, let's go back to Dublier, because that's very interesting. I didn't realize he had a shack and I guess a studio where the parking lot is now. Did he live where the bank is today? Was that his house on Lemoyne Avenue?
No. He lived there in the house that I tell you.
Oh, he was lived on the Bank
he
of
lived
America.
in the back.
Okay.
He had the store in the front, the
Okay.
photo store.
Now that was the old man.
Yeah, the old man.
He was the original. He has a.
Oh, yeah.
He's one of the pioneers, not only of
Yeah.
American film but world cinema.
He was the head cameraman in Fort Lee at that time. Yeah.
Now, did you, as a teenager, did you kids in Fort Lee work for the studios, or is that, like you said, the College of Fort Lee? After you got out of high school, you went there.
Yeah, after we got out of high school. At the time there, that we were old enough to look for work. The studios were gone.
Right.
They were gone. So the only place that we really had a connection was Consolidated Film Industry. They more or less hired everybody from Fort Lee. During the war, you had over 600 people working
Wow.
up there.
Wow.
You had 3 shifts. And then after the war, I mean, I got a job there in 1948, 49. And you meet different people, especially in town. It was a small town, and you meet like the Hawkins family. Hawkins family, Tommy Hawkins was a head cameraman for Paramount News. These guys had different big jobs in New York,
Right.
but they got the jobs from being over here working,
Right.
and they went to New York. Some went to Hollywood, okay? But other than that, we were at that time there, we were the hub of the motion picture industry in America, Fort Lee.
Now, when you say hub, and we have that picture in the background, which is originally the Universal Studios, built in 1914, 1915, and in 1930, as we've learned from you and others, and as well as scholars, Universal sold that property to Consolidated, who you work for, Consolidated
Right.
Republic. Now, Consolidated Republic, the president was Herbert J. Yates, who had an office on that lot as well as Hollywood. Tell us a little about Republic, what kind of studio it was, and also what was that? What did they actually do, and what did you do in that building? But first, let's start off with what was Republic when it came to Fort Lee in 1931 or so.
Well, what Herbie J. Yates did at that time there, he came into money and he started to buy out all the small studios out in Hollywood, like Monogram, stuff like that. They used to make these 90-day wonders westerns. And he tried to make it into, he bought a big lot in the San Fernando Valley, about 28 acres, and he formed Republic Pictures. And what he tried to do is he tried to bring Republic into the world of Paramount and MGM, but he was always known as a 2-bit studio because of the westerns. They were knocking off westerns like there was no tomorrow. He had some characters there, you know. He had he's the only one who signed John Wayne. John Wayne was his biggest star, and he could never make it because he concentrated. He married one of the actors there, Vera. The hell's her name?
Aruba Ralston.
Yeah. Oh, Jesus Christ! We used to see her when we used to get it. Who's in this? Republic Pictures? Her? Oh, Christ Almighty! You look at her. No wonder he didn't make any money. He made any money. She was awful. Jesus Christ.
But it was interesting, you know, and you're absolutely right. According to the history I read about Republic being a very tiny studio, but he did, to his luck, I guess, he had people like John Wayne, and then later on John Ford under contract for certain periods of time, and Roy Rogers. We hear stories about, even though they weren't making films when you were working there. I mean, I think the last film they made at the Main Street area was for Universal in 25, and then when Consolidated got it was basically, and let's go back to that for a minute. Republic Consolidated. Now, Republic with Yates made his films on the West Coast, but he had an office on the East Coast in Fort Lee because, as you said, this was the biggest distribution center. And tell us what you did and what they did there in terms of printing films and how big that was of an operation.
Well, the idea was that when they shot the films in Hollywood, they would ship the negatives, and they would bring it over to Consolidated in Fort Lee. And we would make the prints, let's say the Sands of Iwo Jima. I remember we started off with 5,000 prints.
Wow.
And that was distributed all over the country, all over the world, from Fort Lee. And we did work for Paramount, RKO, MGM, all those, mostly RKO, which was that time there, with a small studio. But we were the distribution center. What we would do, we would print, each motion picture is called a print. That's the whole thing. It consists of 10 reels. And that was about 10,000 feet of film. And when we do that, we had a procedure there that we would have we get big rolls of negative of film, big rolls. The whole movie was on a big roll. Put it on a machine and send it through. And at the other end, we would go into a projection machine, and they would go by fast, and they would clip it off, and then ship it down they had a roller thing there that goes into the shipping room. And they would put it in the can, put the labels on, put whatever they had to do, and they ship it out. Put it in cases. It was a nice process they had up there.
Tell us where, if you could point to that photo of the consolidated, the old Universal lot in Fort Lee, where did you work?
I worked in building number 2.
Okay, and what did you do in building 2?
I was the motion picture developer.
Okay, so that's where all the development was?
Yes, that's where all the development. And then you had studio number 1, which was here. Right here.
And what was going on in there?
They're also printing and they're developing.
Okay, so
you had a setup there where you had, maybe in between these 2 buildings, you had about 10 or 12 developing machines.
Wow.
Going full time.
Wow.
They would go 150 feet per minute.
And where did they store? You said on the side they...
Over here, in this building here, building number 2, they had the shipping room in the back.
Oh.
And the trucks would come down this way, and they'd come around. There was a road here, in between here, and it was like a procedure. Everything was
like a film factory.
Yeah, it was a film factory. That's just what it was.
And where were the vaults?
The vaults were all over here. We had the heartbeat of every motion picture made in America was here in Fort Lee. These vaults here.
It's very interesting because we're talking about this today when the industry, which is for over 100 years has been based on film and product like that was produced in Fort Lee, now it's all going digital. And there will be no more because the studios, as you said, you can get a handle on this, that you were printing thousands of prints for each studio, for each title that was shipped across the United States, and the studios were spending lots of money on that. And again, I don't know if I think we touched on this, but again, there were 3 shifts of people. How many people were employed there?
Oh, and during its peak, about 1,800 people.
Wow, well, that's amazing. Now, what went on in the rest of the plant? If you can point out, like to the front.
This building here was where they had their offices here, upstairs.
So did Yates have his office there?
He must have had one up there, yeah. Down here was where was when we would come into work, we'd go into our lockers over here. And they had like a lunchroom over here too. This building here is where they made the prints to advertise the movie that we were developing in the back. This was very important, this building here.
So all the posters, I have to interrupt you, but all the posters that are worth thousands of dollars today from these movies of the 30s and 40s were printed more than likely in that plant.
Yes, sir.
Wow.
Yeah. They had this 6 printing machines that they would shoot them out, come out like. I used to stop there and talk to my friends, and never realized I grabbed one. In the same building was the original Universal Studios, which was back here. And when we used to go there, because they had a machine shop up there, we used to look up, we used to see lights, and we used to ask the guys, what is that? Well, this is the original Universal Studio. They never took it down. That was this whole building here, the old Universal Studio.
And what did Consolidated, even though they left the Universal equipment in the rafters, did they use the building itself, that section, for anything?
No.
Really?
No.
So it was like just the ghosts of the old studio there?
Yeah, the machines that they were working on, like printing machines,
Right.
they were storing in the big room there.
Wow.
Really something.
It was a massive studio complex then, and really,
Yes,
you had everything there. You had lunchrooms, you had cafeterias, locker rooms. Really was equipped to work around the clock. And now these films, once as you said, they go to the back with the trucks, and these trucks will go into New York and all over the country.
Yeah, they had a distribution center in New York that they would send them over there, and then they would ship them all out all over the country.
And also, from what I heard, you could tell me if I'm wrong, this was also where, if you were a serviceman overseas, all the films that you would see would originate from Fort Lee Prints.
Right.
They distributed to the armed services.
Yes, right.
So that was a massive plant. Any other particular memories of, I'm going to throw some names at you, of people you might know, but there's a gentleman who only passed away a few years ago. I think he worked for Deluxe. He was a very big name on the West Coast, well known in the film industry. Bud Stone. Do you have any memories of Bud Stone?
Oh, yes, Bud, yes. I had a lot of dealings with Bud Stone.
What did he do, and who was he?
Well, he worked in the main office here. He was in charge of going out there and getting work from the different studios. He was very well liked. He had a son, which was he was well liked also. His son wound up on.
That was the son, yes.
And he was a gentleman, I'm telling you.
There was a lot of personalities we talked about who ended up going to the West Coast. We want to talk to you briefly about some of the other studios, but since we're in the VFW post here, and it's very, history's a funny thing, how one piece of Fort Lee history connects to the other. And you often said this, I learned my local history from you, that any history in America really could trace itself to Fort Lee, and the film industry history is one of our most important parts of our history.
Right.
Just out of happenstance, it wasn't planned, but your VFW post is in one of the most important movie theaters, no longer, but the building's still here, the old Fort Lee Theater, built in 1919. So interesting that you end up being in this post for years where there was a movie theater, but that brings to mind a period of time when it was called the Fort Lee Metro, and a gentleman by the name of Eddie Mannix. And I'm just going to throw that name at you, and you tell me something about your memories of Eddie Mannix and the Mannix family.
Well, I remember my mother and father talking about Eddie Mannix, and my father knew Eddie Mannix because he was a spoiled kid in Fort Lee, and they lived right where the library is today. They had a big house there. I remember passing it because he used to cut through there to go to the school in the back there. But they named it Metro because of Eddie Mannix being involved with MGM. We never realized the power that man had. I know that there was a couple of guys that were in the Marine Corps that went out to the West Coast, and they went over there to see Eddie Mannix. And he said to them, if you get out of the service, you will need a job, come and see me. They never did, though. One is the Mills family in Fort Lee, sure. Joe Mills. Sure.
So Eddie, from what we understand, and you could flesh this out for us, Eddie was born in Fort Lee, and where the library is today, thanks to his family, we have some photos of that. Large, as you said, a large house, very, very impressive house. Do you know what his parents did or his father did for a living at all? I don't have no idea.
No.
Yeah. They had some money,
But
though.
his father was very powerful because when the Tisch brothers bought Palisade Amusement Park, and Eddie was getting in trouble, so the old man called up the Tisch brothers.
The Skanks, you mean? Skanks, yes, Skanks.
The Skank brothers, and asked them, could you take care of my son?
That's how he got in there. I didn't know that.
Yeah. He was getting in a lot of trouble.
Oh.
So they says, okay, we'll take your son.
And
so they named him security of the Palisade Amusement Park. Okay? Here's a guy who was causing a lot of trouble, so they put him security.
They were good businessmen.
Yeah. But anyway, they got to like Eddie Mannix. And what happened that during that time period, they got himself involved with MGM.
Right.
With a lot of, because they were making money like they
Right.
know tomorrow. So they didn't trust Louis B. Mayer. They didn't trust him at all. So they sent Eddie out there to look after, make sure that everything was on the up and up. And it wound up that he was named general manager of MGM out there, which was a big joke there. And he produced a few movies,
Yes.
Eddie Mannix. But his job was to enforce to keep the actors and actresses under control, and everybody respected him. He was this guy John Gilbert. When he hit Louis B. Mayer, Eddie Mannix almost killed him. You know, so they sent them out there to check on Louis B. Mayer, and he became best friends.
It's funny, and you're absolutely right about that, because you could see, I've seen it on Turner Classic Movies, and anybody watching this, if you see the one-reelers they have in between movies, they'll show, anytime you see Louis B. Mayer at an Academy Award event or anywhere else, you would expect 9 times out of 10 he would be with one of his starlets, a beautiful woman. Actually, 9 times out of 10 he's with this guy who looks like a bulldog with a cigar in his mouth, and that's Eddie Mannix. So they were very close. Yes, and I tell people, and I learned a lot about Eddie from you, and that's why we want you to talk more about Eddie, but anybody reads a book about MGM history, go to the index and look about Eddie Mannix, and you will see a lot about Eddie. And Eddie, tell me if I'm wrong, but what we understand, Eddie started with MGM from the beginning, I guess 1923, 24. Right. Louis B. Mayer got fired from MGM in the early 50s. Nick Schenck, the president, was dumped in like late 50s, 56, 57. Eddie died still working for MGM in 1963.
Right.
So he was an amazing man.
Oh, yeah.
Tell us about, he didn't forget about Fort Lee. Did he come back to Fort Lee when he was
He used to come back every summer. From where we lived on Main Street, we would look out the window, we could see the back of his sister's house, who lived on Slosser Street.
Right.
And outside her house, when you go up the front steps, they had Leo the Lions on each side.
I remember those lines. Yeah. I didn't know it was, I didn't know that. I remember those lines.
And we used to see a line of cars, with at that time the Cadillacs.
Right.
They used to go down, there was a street off of Main Street, in between where Schweitzer's used to be. It was called a paper street. And they would go down that way, and they'd pull into his sister's backyard.
Wow.
And they would get out there, and that was he would come and see his sister. And he would stay there for maybe a couple of days. And then in the summertime, his sister used to go out there. And he gave his brother-in-law some job. He was the manager of the Capitol Theater.
What was his name, the brother-in-law? I can't think of it, but I know we have pictures of him at the Capitol Theater. Well, you think of it. Yeah. But we had pictures of him, and obviously it was a very big job. So he managed the Capitol Theater in New York, his brother-in-law.
Yeah,
wow.
Yeah.
It's amazing. And what about Eddie's family, in addition to his sister? Didn't he have a brother, was it Augie or Austin?
Austin. Okay, but Austin didn't want no part of the motion picture industry. Austin had a house on Linwood Avenue, and in the back, he opened up a bar. If you want to hear cursing and everything else, you go in there. We went in there because I was working for Charlie Heft. He was the mayor of Fort Lee, and he had a moving company. And we used to go in there, and the guys used to drink. They only gave us soda. That's about all. But we used to. His brother didn't want him to come out there because Austin Maddox would say what's on his mind. Yeah, Jesus Christ. I remember he said, I told Clark Gable, you go shit in your hat. Who the hell do you think you are? Just like that, he says. And my brother would get a little nervous there,
So he was pretty, that's a pretty impressive to make Eddie nervous. He must have been a tough customer.
Was something. You had to laugh at. He had the face of a bulldog.
Yeah.
You talk about that, but Austin Maddox was something.
Now, where on Linwood Avenue was his house and bar? Was it up past the old studios?
No. If you go on Linwood Avenue, you go on the over Route 4.
Right.
And on the left, about 4 or 5 houses in.
Oh,
the house is still there.
Oh.
You'll see it there.
Oh, okay. Well, that's interesting because I've heard from you about Austin and the fact that he was tougher than Eddie. That's interesting. So I never heard the Clark Gable story. That one I like. So Eddie, just before we finish with Eddie, because he's so interesting, the one story I want to touch base with you is obviously, your mother's my grandmother, so I've heard stories from you about Carrie. Your father and your mother knew Eddie and the Mannix family. And at one point, tell me if this is true, did Eddie offer your mom a chance to go out to California at all, or no?
No.
No, okay. That's what I thought she did. No, no, no. But if had she really wanted to, I mean, if you were a person from Fort Lee and you were interested in going out there, I'm sure he would have opened the door or two for you.
Oh yeah, yeah. Anybody from Fort Lee.
Yeah, yeah.
In fact, he gave word down in the main office of the MGM that if anybody comes in there and looks for me in Fort Lee, New Jersey, you get a hold of me. Don't brush him off. That's what happened to Joe Mills. He went in there. He says, "Look, I'd like to see Mr. Mannix. Tell him I'm from Fort Lee." As soon as she heard Fort Lee, she called upstairs. He came down.
Well, you know, there's a wonderful thing for anybody seeing this or listening to this from the museum or on the internet, wherever this ends up. There's wonderful histories of MGM, including When the Lion Roars. And I don't know if you ever saw that, but I'm going to lend you the DVD because I think you'd like it. It's all these interviews from the 60s and 70s of people who worked at MGM and who were alive. And they're wonderful interviews. And one of them was with Sam Marks, who was a writer, then later a producer. This guy worked with Thalberg and all of them. And they asked him about Eddie Mannix, and he leaned to the camera and laughed. And he loved Eddie, obviously. And he said, you know, there was two kinds of tough in Hollywood. Hollywood tough and Jersey tough. And Eddie was Jersey tough. He said, you know, he's the greatest guy in the world, he'd shake your hand, but if you crossed anybody, he'd be your worst enemy. And
Right.
From what we understand from reading, you know, accounts of Clark Gable and Spencer Tracy, they pretty much were contracted to MGM by a handshake from Eddie Mannix. And that's pretty much what it was. They loved Mannix. So there's a great story in Eddie, and Eddie's a Fort Lee boy that really should be more well known than he is, I think. And you fleshed him out for us. Is there any other memories that we may have? Well, just before we end with Eddie, talk about this building, how it was changed from the Fort Lee Theater to the Metro at the time.
Because of Eddie.
Because
he
of
was
Eddie?
connected with Metro Goldwyn Mayer.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, to get back to Eddie, he was very tough. When he found out his wife was fooling around with Superman, he had enough connections as to tell him knock him off.
So you believe that part of it?
Oh, yeah, yeah. Oh, yeah.
That was documented in a movie for all you movie fans, Hollywoodland, recently, the last few years, where George Reeves was either committed suicide or was murdered. And Eddie's second wife, I guess it was his first wife, I think was from Fort Lee, Bernice, I think her name was. She was Irish. His second wife was a dancer, Tony Mannix, and that's the one.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad to get I was going to ask you that, so I'm glad you said what you thought about that, whether you thought it was true or not.
Yeah. Because he had a reputation there that if you crossed him, just what you said, you paid.
We heard rumors, and we don't know whether it's true, and maybe you could tell us, you may not have heard it, but if it sounds like Eddie, there's rumors we heard, you know, some of these publications that when Judy Garland was contracted by MGM as a young star, and then into the 40s when she had some troubles, there was issues of her taking drugs, and apparently, from what we heard, and we have no idea whether this is true or not, Eddie found out who her drug pushers were and had them taken to one of the rides on Palisade Amusement Park and hung by their ankles to stop. So, I don't know, does that sound like Eddie?
Yeah, that sounds like Eddie.
But that interesting thing about Eddie, too, is, and I think you could talk more about this, because there's many people that worked in the film industry in Fort Lee, some of those same people worked at Palisades Amusement Park. Now, Palisades Amusement Park, you mentioned the Skanks, that was part of the film industry, too.
Oh, yeah. They made all their money down there in order for them to go into the motion picture industry.
Right. People, I don't think the general public realizes how important Palisades Amusement Park was in the history of MGM. It might not have been an MGM, so that's an interesting story, because the Skanks' partner was Marcus Lowe, and then they all ended up starting MGM. You know, we talked about MGM, we talk about Universal. One quick question on Universal, this is why I was thinking about this before. That you said you processed all these films from MGM, from RKO. Did you process any Universal films there?
No.
Isn't that funny? Because I was going to say that was originally Universal, and you didn't process any Universal.
No.
Now tell me, this is not specifically a Fort Lee story, but a New Jersey story. Your late brother, Charlie Viola, he worked later in life for Universal, who had their storage vaults in Kearney.
Yeah. I worked out there too.
Oh, did you work out there?
Yeah.
Tell us a little about how the studios ended up even, I mean, it's not a particularly Fort Lee story, but it's still New Jersey, so it's interesting. What was out in Kearney with Universal?
All the old films that Universal had that was made out of nitrate. And they used the vaults out there in which they used to store ammunition. It was out in the Meadowlands out there, and so if it did go up, and our job was to go in there, open up every can, and if we found it deteriorated, take it outside, and put it in a big barrel where there was water. You know. But every film that Universal had was out there.
Wow. Yeah, I didn't realize that.
That was made out of nitrate.
That's amazing. All the original nitrate prints destroyed many studios in Fort Lee, and the only death in the Fort Lee Fire Department history was a result of an explosion and Fred Cavalier.
You know, there's so many big people that came from Fort Lee and went out to Hollywood that we don't know about, you know, that really helped the industry. The head cameraman at MGM was the one in the book there who became the head cameraman at MGM. You had the Tracy family. Now, the Tracy family, the father became head engineer for J. Fletcher Kramer, but his brother became the head electrician at MGM.
What was his first name? His last name was Tracy?
Yeah, his last name was Tracy.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Who else? Anybody else you could remember?
There's a lot of people that went down to Broadway and worked on Broadway. You know.
Well, the Schuberts owned some of the old movie theaters in Fort Lee, so that would make sense. And
but these guys had the experience to go into these different theaters and do what they had to do, because they were doing it on stage over here. As crude as it was a hell of a lot better, because the people that they would hire didn't know anything about the industry.
Yeah.
So it.
Well, you spent your whole life in the film industry before you retired. Tell us a little about that, because you started out at Consolidated, and I love what you said, and I never thought of it that way. I think is brilliant. The idea that was the College of Fort Lee. I think that's a brilliant statement. And so you graduated from that College of Film and eventually went out on your own. Tell us a little about that.
Well, actually, it was when you said you worked at Consolidated in Fort Lee. And we had about 10 guys that left there to go out to California. They all got jobs. I left Consolidated because the Consolidated closed, and I had to go to New York. And somehow I worked my way up to which I had my own little business going, you know. And I don't know how the hell I did it, but I did it. You know.
Was that in New York City, the business you had, or no?
No, it was in Pagoda.
Oh, Pagoda, okay.
Yeah, I bought we bought, me and my partner, we bought a building down there, and we started up a little lab. We did all the greatest fights of the century, stuff like that. I had a connection in New York, which we did a lot of work. It was good while it lasted.
So your entire business career was basically from a kid with you film industry. You're a living part of that element of and again, anybody who lived in Fort Lee at that period of time, or their parents or grandparents, entered the film industry. And it's funny how that history carried over to your generation, because you're not only your father and mother, but your aunts and uncles.
Yeah, my aunt became the head negative cutter for Todd Productions. She did 80 days
around the world in 80 days. Yeah,
she did that.
Did she work in New York City on the west side?
She worked at Deluxe.
Tell us a little about, again, it's not Fort Lee, but you know, New York has changed. It's become so, I mean, Manhattan especially, so expensive and such a residential place. But back in the day, the west side of Manhattan was really like a film lab, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, we had Deluxe over there. And 20th Century Fox had their studios over there.
With the building still there.
Yeah, it's still there.
Yeah, that's when they left Fort Lee. They went there. That's right. And so your aunt worked over on the west side with a lot of people.
Worked over there. The guy she married, he was a big shot over there. And
who did she work for? She said you worked for Todd, but did she work for Deluxe too, or she worked directly for Todd?
She worked for Todd.
Okay. Okay.
And when he shoot a movie, he would get her to cut it.
Wow.
You know. You take 80 days around the world.
Yeah, it's huge film.
Thousands of feet of film, and she had to put it together, and she did a good job.
Yeah, you know what? It's funny you mention that, because it was on Turner Classics a couple of days ago, and it's a magnificent film. It's a very long film, but it was a big hit back in the day.
Yeah.
And boy, she had a lot of work with that film, because it was just.
The only thing that people say, how come your aunt didn't take you and teach you how to cut?
Right.
It was they were a different breed
Right.
at that time. They were always worried about their own job.
Right.
It was always going to be a threat to her.
Right. Well, it was. I guess it would have been different on the West Coast because it was so many more jobs out there.
Oh,
So,
yeah.
big. But again, like we say, and if you look at that picture back there, I mean, Fort Lee was the first film town, and what you're telling us verifies that because so many of your relatives and friends you grew up with started their careers in the movie industry. So even though they weren't making films in Fort Lee, most of Fort Lee was still working in the movie industry right up until the early 60s when Consolidated closed. So it's
I'm
a great
surprised that the industry out there doesn't give this town more credit.
Mm.
This was the incubator. This is where they had to learn how to make movies.
Mhm.
This is where the directors did what they had to do.
Mhm.
Writers. Now up on Lewis Street there, I remember going up there and I was with a couple of guys. I said, well, what the hell is that long building over there? So they say, well, that was the dressing room for the actors, and the script writers were over there. And I remember looking and walking in that building, looking at the long hallways, the little cubby holes, all this stuff like that. Then of course they had in the back there was the big studio, which if that didn't burn down, because that would have been the beginning of a new generation in Fort Lee. Because New York was screaming for space to make commercials.
Right.
I remember Muzzy Orsino, he says to me, Jim, if we had a big thing over here, they would all come over.
Yeah.
Because New York was squeezing them.
It's the same today, and you're right, because the Schuberts, before that fire hit in, I think it was 57, they were planning on using that for television production, from what we understand. And they were marketing also the studio on John Street for production as well. So, and to this day, Jimmy, we get calls from people who read about Fort Lee's history and think we still have these stages here, and they're interested to come in from New York because they're still squeezed for space in New York. I think it's a shame that we never capitalized on that in a way, because it could still put a lot of people in Fort Lee to work, but who knows what the future holds. But we appreciate you sharing your memories. Is there anything else that you'd want to talk about in terms of the film industry in Fort Lee, or growing up in Fort Lee?
No, I remember working for McArdle's. He had a grocery store on the corner of Hudson Street, Main Street. And they were tearing down the Fox Studios up there. And I stood there and I watched the whole damn thing come down. And this was an end of an era,
You think a studio like 20th Century Fox starting in Fort Lee and becoming very successful in Fort Lee, and you saw it, when they were taking it down, but that's one of the world's most important studios still in operation today. So it's an amazing thing. Talking about Fox real quick, while you mentioned it, it's funny because sometimes we talk about Universal, and this exhibit with Universal, we'll get you into the museum. Part of it, we have an exhibit on Law and Order Special Victims Unit, because over the last half a dozen years, Universal has come back to Fort Lee to shoot exteriors, which is really cool to see these big Universal trucks back in Fort Lee. Well, I think in 1947 or 48, Fox came back to Fort Lee, right across the street from their studio, to shoot a film with Victor Mature called The Kiss of Death, and the scenes they shot were inside and outside the old Holy Angels. Do you have any memories of Fox coming back for that?
No, I remember the time when they said they're shooting up there.
Yeah.
They said it's wasn't too much, It's Richard Woodmark.
Yeah. Yes. The old lady down the stairs.
Other than that, don't recall at that time there anybody coming into town.
Yeah, that was a rare instance back in the 40s, because they weren't really other than there was a lot of independent small motion picture producers going into these studios, but no films from the level of
we lost
studios.
our big chance is when CNBC
Yes.
was up there.
Yes.
They should have, if they would have condemned that property,
Yes.
bought the goddamn thing themselves.
Studio City.
Yeah, they could have named that what's up there in Englewood Cliffs,
Yes.
right over there, and all the problems would have been solved.
I agree with you. That was a lost opportunity, and that would have continued to keep Fort Lee's name
Oh, yeah.
out there as a production center. And that was It was a sad situation. But if we had somebody with your experience and know-how in a decision-making area, I'm sure that would have came to Fort Lee, and that's to our disadvantage. But before we end, I'd like to just show you this. I mean, you worked for Universal, and let's show you this and take a look at this. We'll put this up here. And this logo is a variation. Universal has a lot of logos. You remember that logo from the 30s and 40s. Yeah. But this is the logo that was born in Fort Lee. Universal didn't have that. We sent that out to them. That was from 1912. Not changed too much. It looks a little, it's a cool looking logo. But and this is a picture of the studio you worked in, right? Universal Fort Lee. And here's a picture of Law and Order working at the Napoli restaurant for Universal. So it's a great way to connect that history from yesterday. And I'm sure you've dealt with the making prints of all of these films over the years, or certainly when you worked at Universal in the vaults, you had them there. But we want to get you over to the museum and take a look at this, and maybe speak. One of our our historical society meetings. Anytime I see Universal film, I always think of Fort Lee, because this is a great studio that had roots in Fort Lee. And Jimmy, thanks so much for sharing your memories. I know we're going to get you back to the museum to talk more about this, but you're a living history, and we wanted to start this living history project with you because, as I said, you're the big kahuna of film in Fort Lee. So all of us thank you for your time, and I'm going to shake your hand. Thank you, Jim. Not only my friend, you're my uncle, and I'm proud to call you my uncle, and I'm very proud of all the work you did in the movie industry. And I'd like to thank you personally, because it's really because of you and people like you, but mainly because of you, that we have a film commission in Fort Lee, and that we are doing, like you said, trying to put signs up to let people know about this history. I know that's very important for you, and that's what we're doing based on what you taught us. So thank you, Jim, and we're going to see Jim at the museum soon.